What's up guys, it's Punchy here, and today we're back with something a little bit different, a deep dive investigation. As many of you know, I absolutely love creating builds that showcase unique playstyles or draw inspiration from my favorite characters in various series. These builds all come together in the world of Deepwoken, our favorite game that offers unparalleled customization options. There's so much you can do with this game's build mechanics that you just won't find anywhere else, but not everything turns out to be as effective as you'd hope. I've been told that I have a tendency to highlight a lot of slept-on abilities to mess around with, and honestly, throughout my time in Deepwoken, I've tried just about all of them. But let's be real, not everything here is a hidden gem. Some of these are straight up terrible. So today, I've taken the time and done my best to sift through all the options to bring you my definitive list of the top 10 most useless Deepwoken mantras. To be honest, I was pretty impressed by the overall selection of mantras that we see in the game. It wasn't easy to find 10 that truly have zero use, which says a lot about the game's design. That said, before we dive into the list, let's take a moment to define what I really mean by the word useless. All of the mantras and their sparks on this list aren't necessarily what I consider bad, but rather they really have no practical use. Sure, every mantra comes with its own set of balancing issues, but the ones here never really found a place in either PvE or PvP content. They don't fill any meaningful niche, and they tend to fail in almost every interaction. Stuff like Summon Cauldron still has a purpose, and those we won't be talking about. But the most important part is how they compare to other options that are realistically just better. Honestly, it's kind of funny to see how out of place some of these end up being. Anyway, I'll be ranking the top 10 most useless mantras in order from most useful to the absolute worst, but let's be real, they're all so bad this list might as well be interchangeable. Also, if I happen to disrespect your favorite mantra, fail to use it perfectly, or miss something important, feel free to let me know down below in the comments. With this video, I genuinely want some discussion here, and my ultimate goal is for all of these moves to have a real purpose, and today we're here to figure out what's holding them back. Finally, just for a standard, all mantras here will be showcased at level 5 or their maximum potential. So without further ado, let's dive in. Let's kick off our investigation with the multiplying spark variant of Gale's Windforge. Honestly, it feels strange to even put Windforge and useless in the same sentence, but we're still here. Don't get me wrong, this isn't the worst mantra out there, but I can't think of a single scenario where using the multiplying spark is better than just sticking with the base version. So, what makes the normal Windforge just superior? Let's break it down. The base version of Windforge is a solid mantra that auto-aims at nearby targets, forcing them into an interaction where they have to defend against multiple delayed wind daggers that hit at once. It's a pressure-heavy, spammy option that demands respect, and it's good. With solid posture damage and decent overall damage by itself, it's great for stacking alongside other moves. Now, here's the wild part. The base version has a unique mechanic. It forces blocking players to drop their guard and they have to repress F. Not only does this add insane pressure, but it also forces your opponent to reblock quickly, making it an absolute menace in the right hands or right build. Now, with the multiplying variant, much of Windforge stays the same. You still spawn multiple daggers and can act freely during the windup. However, these daggers don't hit simultaneously, making them way easier to react to. Sure, it actually deals more posture damage if all these attacks land, but that's a big if since they're super easy to block and parry. The worst part, this version doesn't even force an unblock, meaning players can simply hold F and tank the entire thing. Overall, it still applies pressure and deals decent posture damage, but the delayed effect and lack of defense negation make it far weaker. Sure, it's not terrible, but the base Windforge completely outclasses it, and this isn't a side grade, it's a straight downgrade. Next up with an oath, it's the Arc Warder's Arc Beam Air variant. So realistically, this mantra isn't that terrible, but the Arc Beam's base underperforms consistently, and the Air variant is just worse and harder to use. On a successful hit, we deal a mix of Thunder Call and Flame Charm damage, applying their respective statuses, but after that, our pressure almost instantly ends. After ragdolling players, it's kinda hard to hit people with anything else since we're in the air. The main reason why I place this in the useless category for attacking tools is how we can activate it entirely. This ability requires some sort of height to use, forcing players to fall from a height, jump up with an ability, or uppercut, and sometimes the base jump isn't gonna cut it. It's almost impossible to use this mantra consistently since it oftentimes defaults to the linear shot in the air if your timing is incorrect. So for underwhelming damage and nonsense required to activate, it's really not worth trying out. Next Next up, let's talk about Ice Forge and all of its respective sparks. I won't separate them individually, but as a whole, this mantra struggles to find a purpose compared to the rest of Frostraw's impressive arsenal. For a fair judgment, I'll be reviewing this at its peak potential using Drift and Rush Shards for maximum speed. The base version fires a flurry of ice shurikens which track targets and hit after a noticeable delay. Using speed mods, the projectiles themselves are near instant, but the windup gives opponents plenty of time to react. And when it does land, the damage is underwhelming, the chill effect is pretty weak, and the craziest part, it deals 0 posture damage. So no matter what you do, this mantra just doesn't deliver at a baseline, which honestly makes no sense. Funny enough though, that's just the basic Ice Forge, and it gets even worse. If you add a Blast Spark, now your shurikens explode on impact, applying chill and damage to nearby enemies. Sounds pretty good, right? Well, the trade-off is that you lose damage and the explosion AoE doesn't really do that much. So I ask you, who in their right mind picks Ice Forge for crowd control? The answer is nobody's doing that because it's objectively not worth it. Then there's the Magnet Spark, which lets you teleport to enemies if a shuriken misses. It's definitely a cool idea, but here's an alternative. You can already do this with a Wayward Gem after a delay. The Magnet Spark would be handy if the auto-tracking on the mantra didn't work so well that it's almost impossible to miss your target consistently. To somehow activate this, you'll end up having to look at the side to pull it off, and even then, it doesn't always work, leaving you unprepared for your teleport. It's almost like the base mantra is fighting against itself with the spark. At the end of the day, Ice Forge is a very weak Froststraw pressure tool when there are far better options out there, specifically with the element. The Blast Spark just weakens it further by trying to make it an AoE tool, and the Magnet Spark complicates your approach. Honestly, it's just not worth using, and the sparks kinda feel like troll options. Next up, we have the Needle Barrage Blast Spark. The base mantra is one of the best for Ironsing, offering a ton of versatility, and why would you want to change that? The base mantra lets you jump out of range, auto-aims to targets, deals pretty solid damage with a low cooldown, and even places a lot of rods. The only real downside is that parrying once parries the rest of the shots, but other than that, it's pretty solid and unpunishable. Now, with the Blast Spark, everything here starts going downhill. Instead of jumping into the air, you shoot a linear burst of needles directly in front of you. There's also no more auto-aim, no more mobility, and you're grounded and stuck. The damage is generally the same, but it feels like you're placing fewer rods if they all land. Also, the defense options remain completely unchanged, but there's no real advantage to the modification. With this spark, you risk completely losing your mobility, and honestly, I can't think of any situation where this would be better than the base version, and it's just underwhelming. Moving on to slot 6, let's talk about the Crystal Knee Spring Spark. The base version of this mantra already outclasses any of its variants, and while it's not bad, it's generally not the most optimal choice. The normal Crystal Knee launches enemies into the air with a pretty quick wind-up, opening up combo potential, especially when paired with Crystal Impale and other aerial mantras. It might not be the best for pressure, and the damage is serviceable at best, but it's got a clear purpose and works well in specific situations. Now, the Spring Spark changes things up, but not in a really good way. In the world of Deepwoken, knockback mantras aren't too common, but this one sends enemies away instead of sending them into the air for combos. Additionally, the animation and end lag for this mantra feels strange in comparison to other options, and it's still pretty weird. The windup is easy to react to, and follow-up projectiles aren't reliable for true combos, so what's the point? It's definitely not the worst ability in the game, trust me, it's gonna get worse, but overall, it just doesn't really offer anything better than the base Crystal Knee. It's an underwhelming get-off-me option that falls flat, and yeah, that's about it. Next up, let's talk about Ice Blade in all of its full, horrendous glory. Honestly, there's nothing that really makes this mantra great, it kinda just exists. The base version does decent damage while slowing enemies, but it has terrible posture damage on defense, and often moves the user past their targets. Sure, you can cancel this move to try and extend a combo, but it kinda works against you since it moves you around. It's janky and just not too fun in most situations. To make things worse, Ice Blade is super easy to shut down. Its windup and end lag are extremely punishable, and it cancels if the first few attacks are parried. And if you like, for the cost of a talent slot, you can cast this while sliding to hit enemies with a single Ice Slash, which isn't that good. The talent's pretty awkward to use and doesn't offer much, and the cooldown on the slide variant feels like a complete waste. So at the end of the day, if you want a spinning, combo-based move to catch players from a distance, Rising Frost is way easier to use, less costly, and less less punishable. Ice Blade just doesn't offer anything unique, and honestly, I can see why nobody picks it. Next up, we have Lightning Stream's Reversal Spark, which is definitely a potential troll ability. I totally get why it exists, but honestly, there's just no real reason to use it. So, the base Lightning Stream pulls enemies towards you, while the Reversal Spark does the opposite by pulling you towards the target and closing that gap. With the normal stream, there's only one real way to pull enemies close, but there's way more options to move yourself with this mantra. Here's the problem: to get the same exact benefit, you can use Stream's Blast Spark variant with a Wayward Gem to deal damage while also teleporting you to your target. By doing this, that makes the Reversal Spark pretty much obsolete. Like, don't get me wrong, I would genuinely be annoyed if this spark didn't exist, like it does make sense, but there's no reason to pick this up when other approach options do the job faster and are better. Moving forward, let's talk about the Ice Laser Spring Spark, and this one doesn't need much of an intro. The base mantra itself has been around since the release of Crystallization, and while the base Ice Laser is still a decent mix-up tool, it's nowhere near its prime. The fast wind-up and decent speed of the projectile make it useful in many situations, and you can even mod it for spam with size modifications. Sure, it's reactable and can be parried, but it's still a solid option for applying pressure. Now, onto the Spring Spark, which honestly just doesn't cut it. This mantra spark adds a delay to the laser projectile, and it doesn't do much except give players a chance to dodge or sidestep it. Maybe in some situations it can catch somebody off guard the first time they encounter it, but once they know it's coming, all they need to do is move around to completely negate your mix-up tool. And when it comes to the spam version, it's even worse. Players can easily sidestep the shots, and one attack can disable the projectiles entirely. The idea behind it, a delayed attack for added pressure, isn't too terrible, but the damage, posture pressure, and projectile speed are all pretty weak. So, the question still stands, why use this when Frostdraw has far better options? I mean, Ice Daggers, Ice Chain, Ice Spikes, and even Ice Forge all do what this is trying to do, but objectively better. It's honestly the closest we're gonna get to Time Stop in Deepwoken, so I guess I'm gonna accept it, but it's not good. Finally, we're talking about a mantra that you've probably all seen coming, Ceasless Slashes. Honestly, this ability is a disgrace to everything it tries to be. A gap closer, a pressure option, a mobility tool, and even a stealth technique, it fails on every single front. This mantra puts the user into a stealth state, modifying only their M1 attacks. Any other action or taking damage instantly removes you from that state and cancels the mantra. On top of that, if you take too long to even do an attack, the move will end early. So, when landing a hit, the user gets a speed boost, but the flurry of slashes doesn't really speed up as the sound might suggest. Every single hit has a set timing, meaning it's very easy to interrupt or defend against. The windup is also pretty significant to initiate this, leaving you vulnerable while you start it up. Also, the damage being dealt here is weak at best, and your options become severely limited during this mode. So, what exactly is the point of this mantra? It's slow, with a hefty windup, the damage is underwhelming, it costs a ton of ether to maintain, and you lose access to all of your other moves. Sure, it's unique, but it doesn't specialize in anything useful. Nothing about Ceaseless Slashes can even be acceptable. It's one of the worst, most useless mantras in the entire game. Wrapping up our mantra discussion, let's dive into the Frozen and Burning Servant's Reversal Spark. Players have long complained about the combat viability of these base mantras, and while I still think they're weak, they do serve a purpose when they do work. Both normal servants hit when they spawn and hit again as they vanish, and it's decent for pressure, but nothing special. Now, let's talk about the Reversal Spark. So, with Burning Servants, we can push enemies away from the outside of our hitbox, ragdolling them. The problem is that we need to position ourselves perfectly to align the edge of the servant's circle to even hit them. Also, on top of that, the initial hit pushes them away, making it much harder for the secondary burst to land, and the ragdoll effect isn't really useful for combo setup. Simply, this is already pretty bad, and it only gets worse from here. On to Frozen Servants, the positioning issue is also pretty similar, but now it doesn't even ragdoll or push enemies away. The only change is that the damage hitbox is flipped, making it harder to land, and it's worse. Honestly, I found no use for either of these variants, and they kinda just suck. So between the awkward positioning, reduced damage, and inability to set up combos, I believe these are the most useless mantras in all of Deepwoken. And that's a wrap on my list of the most weak and unjustifiable mantras in the game. If I missed anything or overlooked some tech, drop a comment down below. I really want to get a discussion going because the the goal here is to make all of these mantras genuinely useful. Seriously, there's no hate in this video about any mantras, just criticism, because I really want to make these abilities shine. Anyway, this took a while to record and test, and if you want to help me out, please like and subscribe. Thanks so much to all my loyal members for motivation and direct support to my channel, and if you want, you can join up down below. Once again, thank you, and we're trying to reach a goal of 110k subs. Have a good one, it's punchin' time.